Likewise, victimization survey data has both methodological strengths and weaknesses. There's always trade-offs. Some advantages to victimization data and victimization methodologies include providing direct measures of crime victimization for a wide range of crimes. Sometimes we do want to study who is a victim of crime as much as we want to study who commits crimes or how many crimes are committed. What are the characteristics of the victims? Well, the only way to find those things out in a lot of cases is actually go talk to real crime victims. And it also gives us kind of a way of checking on how many crimes might go unreported to the police. Further, it doesn't suffer the same problems with underreported crimes as UCR data. You kind of go directly to the horse's mouth, to use a metaphor. You go directly to crime victims and you ask them, what kinds of crimes they suffered. And they may very well tell you about crimes they never reported to the police. But victimization survey data has methodological limitations too. For example, there are subtle issues about whether people were actually victims of real crimes, and if so, establishing exactly which laws were broken. You can't just go out and ask people if they were victims of criminal assault, for example. They may not know exactly where the lines are drawn, exactly how the crime is defined. What's aggravated assault, what's simple assault, for that matter, what falls just on this side of not being criminal. People may not understand. And for that matter, people may misinterpret what happened to them. They may misunderstand what happened to them. Researchers have come up with a whole bunch of rules and procedures to try to eliminate those problems, to control for them the best they can. And on a personal note, I think they've done a fairly good job, but still it is an open question whether, whether maybe sometimes there are some problems with accurately counting how many people were really victims of real crimes. That's a little bit of an ongoing issue. Also, survey subjects may give inaccurate answers due to faulty recall or, for that matter, outright deception. For instance, many crime victims have criminal records themselves and might have reasons to lie. You got to realize that a lot of times people who are victimized by crime have lengthy criminal histories and may have been involved in criminal activities at the times that they were victimized. For example, someone who's robbed of drugs and beaten up and assaulted. Well, they may have been involved with other people engaged in crime, they may have been involved in crime themselves, and that may give them pretty strong incentives not to report those crimes to the police, but also not to tell researchers about those kinds of crimes if it would basically incriminate them or make them look bad or embarrass them. At any rate, there's always those kinds of questions. Finally, victimization data is based on supposedly random samples from some larger population, the U.S. population in general. This raises possible questions about whether the sampling procedures really produce representative samples. That's always going to be a problem with sampling. And of course, we are talking about victimization surveys based on supposedly random samples. Finally, self-report surveys offer their own advantages and disadvantages. Self-report surveys are not nearly as common in criminological research as either UCR data or victimization surveys. But still, sometimes it is an important clue, an important source of data to study crime or issues relating to crime. On the positive side, self-report surveys can provide information about deviant or criminal subpopulations that might otherwise be impossible to gather. Sometimes you, again, have to go to the horse's mouth and ask them, well, what kinds of crimes did you commit? How did you commit them? And so forth. Some cases there may be no other way realistically to get that kind of data. For example, it allows researchers to study the criminal techniques, methods, and crime histories of, say, professional burglars or drug pushers. You go to them and maybe they can tell you how many crimes they've committed, how they learned how to commit those crimes, how they got away with the crimes, how they prepared for the crimes, and so forth and so on. Further, self-report research has sometimes produced unique, controversial findings and thereby inspired new empirical and theoretical debates. Sometimes the results are counterintuitive. Sometimes they kind of lead us to ask new questions. For example, it suggests self-report surveys have suggested that minor acts of juvenile delinquency may be far more common than previously believed and may not vary too much across different social classes, across different racial and ethnic groups, and so forth. Traditional researchers, based on things like UCR data and victimization surveys, they tended to think that, well, poorer kids, minority kids, engaged in a whole lot more juvenile delinquency compared to upper class kids, white kids, and so forth. Well, it turns out when you actually go out and ask kids about what kinds of juvenile delinquency they have engaged in themselves, you'll find out that a lot of middle class and upper class white kids will say that they commit just about the same levels of delinquency as kids from the wrong side of the tracks, kids from poorer homes, kids from minority communities, and so forth. If you ask kids how many of them drink illegally or use illegal drugs, once again, you get kind of similar results, which raises some questions about really how big are the differences in these patterns of minor juvenile delinquency, drug abuse, and so forth across different groups. On the negative side, however, measurement validity with respect to self-report data is highly questionable due to obvious motivations to avoid self-incrimination, problems with Foley recall, etc. Sometimes people just don't remember exactly how many crimes they committed, or when they committed them, or exactly what kind of crime it was. And sometimes they exaggerate, they distort, they lie. And more importantly, they have obvious incentives to lie. Because, well, they could very well be incriminating themselves. Or, in some cases, maybe they're telling a tall tale, a fish story, embellishing or simply making stuff up. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell exactly how they're lying, which makes it even more problematic. Such problems are almost inevitable when you ask criminals about the crimes that they have personally committed. Another problem is that self-report surveys are almost never based on random samples of the larger population. Instead, focusing on smaller subpopulations like juveniles or known criminals. Most self-report surveys are smaller scale, and they only focus on smaller groups. A lot of times kids or people who are involved in the criminal justice system. They're in jail or they're on probation. And they're people who are available to be studied. So external validity of these findings is often very weak. Who can you generalize the results to? Well, maybe not so many people. Maybe not anyone in the larger population with much confidence or safety. The larger point as we step back is that each of these different techniques, each of these different measurement approaches to measuring crime or things related to crime have their own particular strengths and weaknesses. None of them are perfect. There's always going to be trade-offs. But at least if we understand a little bit about those trade-offs, it'll help us guide us to figure out which kinds of data to trust the most in which ways. And by combining different sources of data, measuring crime in different ways, sometimes we can kind of play them off against each other. For example, if you look at victimization surveys, they typically suggest that there's a lot more crime than UCR data indicates. That makes perfect sense if you have substantial underreporting of crime to the police, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we believe that there is substantial unreported crime. You get the point? The point is that by using more than one source of data, we have multiple clues. And we can put those clues together like pieces in a puzzle and try to get a more accurate understanding about what's really happening in the real world. Well, that finishes up our discussion on measurement of crime. In our last of our series of videos on topics related to crime, we're going to talk a little bit about socio-biological approaches or social biological approaches to crime. Thank you very much.